Wow. Hey, pura vida, mi gente. We back once again. Yeah, two videos today, huh? Yeah, I just felt like reading to you guys today. Going over some of this information more in detail since we have a lot of new subscribers. Shout out to Ocelot 12 or Olmec 12 for the beat you just heard. Pure water. It's called wata or water. Wata. Pure agua. Pure water. That was a nice little beat, right? Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate everybody in the chat. Wanted to make sure we had a good crowd, so guess we got a good crowd going. It doesn't matter who shows up or not. We're gonna get started. All right. So today we're gonna go ahead and get into this article right here. It says here, communities of Port Jews and their contacts in the Dutch Atlantic world by Wim Kloester. This is from the Jewish History, Volume 20, Number 2, Port Jews of the Atlantic, 2006, pages 129 to 145. Okay. So we have gone over the abstract before, but we never read the full article, and that's what we're gonna do today. Had to go ahead and purchase all that. We gotta do it sometimes just to get the drop, right? So that's what we're gonna get into. Again, from the Clark University in Worcester, Wim Kloester, Communities of Port Jews and Their Contacts in the Dutch Atlantic World. All right. Second. Okay. It says here, in the late 16th century, Jews and conversos created a trading network that tied together ports in Portugal, Brazil, and the Netherlands. Hold on, guys. Okay. This network became the chief Dutch commercial circuit in the first quarter of the 17th century, talking about the 1600s, and offered benefits to Jews and conversos that were not solely economic ones. This circuit made it possible for Brazilian New Christians to return to Judaism in Amsterdam and Amsterdam Jews to establish a community in Brazil. In the process, the port Jews of Recife, Brazil, and Amsterdam became closely connected, especially after warfare closed off access to Portuguese ports in the network. Amsterdam Jews arrived in force in Recife during the 1630s, but traveled back to Amsterdam during the years 1645 and 54 and 1654. Since the Dutch colony in Brazil was shrinking and eventually was captured by Portuguese troops. So again, this is Catholics versus so-called Protestants, right? Or New Christians, the conversos. These are crypto Jews, Sephardic Moorish people. Remember what we've been learning all along, right? When you say the Portuguese Jews, that's the Catholics. The Portuguese Catholics are in town. Jews contributed commercially, financially, and militarily to this short-lived colony and were rewarded with privileges, which for this time were remarkable. Port Jews, in parentheses, it has been said, were travelers, strangers, boundary crossers, and cultural brokers, purveyors of products between far and near. So true is the statement that port Jews must be viewed from a perspective much like that used by practitioners of Atlantic history, who place interconnectedness at center stage. Their studies concentrate on the flow of people, commodities, microbes, and information, and in the end, they offer a new perspective that goes beyond traditional one of studying people in their immediate locale and changes the way we understand people, communities, and nations. For it takes into account social, cultural, political, and economic impact over a wide area, in our case in particular, that of the Atlantic world. This perspective is especially useful for studying Jews and crypto Jews in the 17th century Dutch colonies of Recife in Brazil and Willemstad in Curaçao. These port Jews par excellence will now be at the center of this study. The Jews of New Amsterdam, who were not commercially important, and the Jews of Suriname, who settled in the New World expressly in order to engage in plantation agriculture, will not be discussed. The port Jews who settled in Dutch colonies began their journey in Portugal, from where they migrated to Brazil in Northern Europe in the late 16th century. All right, very important. So you can have a context. When we talk about Portuguese Jews, right? Talking about Sephardic Jews, people of very dark complexion. The general consensus at that time in all primary sources state the same thing. The Jews of Portugal were swarthy people, so-called black. All right, let's get that clear right away. They did not sever relations with their native soil, but created a commercial network that tied together Portugal, northeastern Brazil, and Amsterdam into a neat triangle. The well-traveled commercial highway between Brazil and the Dutch Republic enabled Brazilian new Christians, right, These are conversos. Knew why they knew? Because they were Sephardic Moorish people, Muslims. Remember, Muslims and Moorish people are included. To return to Judaism in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam Jews to establish a community in Brazil. Remember, after the Inquisition hit, they had to flee from Spain and Portugal, and a lot of them ended up in Amsterdam. That became their New Jerusalem. Sephardic Jews held it down there, were very prosperous, and that's where they created their Dutch West Indian companies, their Dutch trade. These are your so-called Dutch. In the process, the poor Jews of Recife and Amsterdam became intimately connected. Of course they did. They're the same people and all related. Many poor Jews from Amsterdam settled in Recife and the adjacent town of Mauricia. Remember what we read recently? This is all before the so-called Ashkenazi started taking over these uh, commerce trades and stuff and ports and businesses. This temporary relief from caring for the poor came to an end. However, after 1645, when the Portuguese conquest of Brazil forced the Jews, now illegally living there, to return to Amsterdam, some of the returnees were also well to do, and they provided the Amsterdam Jewish community with a significant commercial stimulus. Yet it would be wrong to view the Sephardim, remember? Sephardim in the colonial America, we just read this recently, in the Dutch orbit merely as beneficiaries of enlightened policies. Sephardim in Portugal and Brazil helped shape Dutch transatlantic trade, while others contributed significantly to the creation and expansion of Dutch Atlantic ports. Jews also distinguished themselves on the battlefield, which prolonged the life of Dutch Brazil. The privileges these Jews received were a reward for indispensable contributions. The three stages of Sephardi port Jewry. Many of the Sephardim studied here did not revert to Judaism until after they had migrated from the Iberian Peninsula to Northern Europe. The same goes for the Sephardim who David Sorkin has studied. Sorkin argues that many of the conversos and crypto Jews, okay, that's what we're talking about, don't forget, who left the Iberian Peninsula moved to the Mediterranean ports of Venice and Livorno, the Atlantic ports of Bordeaux, London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg, and the New World ports of Jamaica, Suriname, Recife, and New Amsterdam. All right. So again, we just read recently, right, about the pirates of the Caribbean and all these Sephardic Jews and Moorish people settling in all these islands of the Caribbean, right, establishing settlements there. Many of those who remained in Spain and Portugal were active in commerce as well. The result was a Sephardi trade network, which connected the old Mediterranean routes with the new Atlantic economy. This portrayal may be further articulated in the Atlantic world. There were three, partly overlapping stages in the history of Sephardi port Jews, those of Antwerp, the Spanish Atlantic, and the European North Atlantic. The first began in the mid 16th century, when Portugal's trade with Brazil grew more important, as new Christian merchants came to control commercial ties with Brazil. They also became heavily involved in the African slave trade. Gosh, the hijack. It was in reverse, yeah. Remember? They were the ones, right? Portuguese and Sephardics, a lot of these people were the ones enslaving, capturing the American Indians. Check out my series, The Real Slave Trade, all 4 or 5 parts, so you can understand. It was in reverse. In Europe, their presence was particularly important in the Flemish port of Antwerp, which rapidly became one of Europe's main commercial centers, combining the functions of entrepot and financial center. Converso merchants settling in Antwerp enjoyed a special asset, their excellent relations with the Portuguese crown, which practically monopolized the spice trade. Consequently, Jonathan Israel writes, in the last decades of the 16th century, until 1595, almost the whole distribution of Portuguese East Indian spices and Brazil sugar to northern Europe was handled by the Portuguese New Christians residing in Antwerp. The Crown Union between Spain and Portugal in 1580 signaled the start of the second stage, during which conversos businessmen crossed the Spanish border and infiltrated the Seville-based trade with the Americas. The Portuguese merchants or their agents settled in Panama, Lima, Buenos Aires, and Cartagena, the Indias, the Carthage of the Indias. Cartagena, huh? Or is it the original? Kurdish of the original Indies, India, of the three Indias. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Second, guys. Yeah. The increased complexity of the Sephardi trade networks can be seen in the activities of two conversos, Garcia de Ilan Barraza and Manuel Bautista Perez. Lisbon-born Garcia de Ilan, a staunch Catholic who worked his way up to become one of the premier Portuguese financiers at the court of Spain's King Philip IV, also conducted trade with his brothers in Cartagena de Indias and Lima, as well as with Jewish or crypto-Jewish business partners in Valencia, Amsterdam, Antwerp, London, and Hamburg. Manuel Bautista Perez, a Portuguese merchant, who's the merchants, who moved from Seville to Lima in Peru around 1620, dealt, all right, these are melanated people, so-called black people, dealt in what? In slaves, pearls, jewelry, indigo, and textiles from Spain and China. His commercial contacts extended to Seville, Lisbon, Luanda de Angola, Veracruz, Guatemala, Panama, Cartagena de Indias, Potosí, and Santiago de Chile. At the same time, he was the linchpin of a more localized Peruvian network by also investing in the Portuguese trade with Asia. Men such as Perez spanned the world by selling products from the Indian subcontinent at trade fairs in Spanish America and shipping American silver to the Far East. They brought Atlantic and Asian trade into one orbit. The growing economic power of new Christians, so-called new Christians, right, may have brought the Spanish Inquisition into play, most famously in Lima, where an alleged conspiracy in 1639 resulted in an auto de fe in which Perez and 10 others died at the stake. All right. Very important historic moment. You know, they're still doing the Inquisition, lynching, and burning at the stake the people who were getting caught practicing Judaism and Muslim Islamic faith in the Americas because they were supposed to have been converted or practicing Christianity or being Catholics. The mid 17th century was a traumatic period for American conversos, many of whom assimilated into old Christian society, assimilated, especially in Peru and later in New Spain or Mexico, right? The third stage in the history of Sephardi Port Jews began at a time roughly contemporaneous to the second, about the end of the 16th century. The Portuguese Inquisition had become more active, and the Dutch ban on trade with the Flemish coast, introduced in 1595, was causing problems for Antwerp's commerce with Portugal. The combined effect was that new Christians left their native soil in large numbers and moved to northern Europe, but their destination was no longer primarily Antwerp, which was losing its significance as an international commercial center. They went instead to Amsterdam, Hamburg, Rouen, and a number of other towns that had previously received Portugal's colonial imports from Antwerp. We may speak of Port Jews proper only in this third stage when Sephardim finally began to profess Judaism freely, first in northern European ports and after 1630 in Dutch and English port cities in the New World as well. Relocating from Brazil to Amsterdam, right? So when the Catholics eventually took over their whole business because they had set up shop for the Catholics, they were working for them. And that's how they were able to stay alive and be able to go and not get killed, you know. And they were, you know, being controlled and say, hey, you got to be Christians. But eventually they came and took over all that. They just used them. And they had to return. Some of them to Amsterdam. A lot of them went to the Caribbean islands. We read that. So here's one version of it is them relocating to Amsterdam again from Brazil. The three stages thus overlapped as the protagonists of the first two stages cleared the way for those of the third. The Dutch established colonies in Brazil in 1624 to 25 and 1630 to 1654. That's a lot of years. But prior to these conquests, scores of conversos from the New World had begun to trade with Amsterdam and to travel there. Confessions and accusations obtained by the tribunal of the Spanish Inquisition in Cartagena de Indias revealed that Antonio Mendez, who lived as a Jew in Amsterdam in the 1620s, had previously resided in Santa Fe de Bogota. All right, he was a Sephardic Jew who had lived in Colombia, then he all of a sudden was in Amsterdam. Antonio Hernandez had moved to Amsterdam from a small town in New Granada. The attraction of Amsterdam was even stronger for Portuguese crypto Jews in Brazil. Diogo Gomes Lobato left Portugal for Brazil in 1599 and transferred from there to Amsterdam. João Caselli moved from Pernambuco in northeastern Brazil to Amsterdam before 1604, and Simão Gomes Dias traveled in 1609 from Pernambuco to Lisbon, back to Portugal, fleeing from there to Amsterdam. Like these people constantly fleeing, remember what the Sephardic and Moorish people went through with the Catholics in Europe, before they started colonizing North America. So in Pernambuco, he stayed in the house of Manuel Cardoso Milão, who later moved to London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg. The co-owner of a sugar mill in Pernambuco, Portuguese-born João Luis Henriquez, moved to Amsterdam with his sons Manuel Sanchez and Jerónimo Henriquez, or Geronimo Jerónimo, who declared themselves Jews in Amsterdam. So they were they were pretending to be Christians wherever they were in the Americas, but when they went back to a lot of the European cities, they were able to go ahead and become Jews again or practice their faith openly. Other former residents of Pernambuco who arrived in Amsterdam in the 1610s included Manuel Carvalho, Thomas Fernandez, Joseph Razao, Gonzalo Núñez, David Ovalle, Paulo Pinto, and Diego Núñez Victoria. Finally, Manuel de Campos left Bahia and settled in Amsterdam in 1619. These men were all merchants, and many of them were involved in exporting Brazilian sugar to Amsterdam. These are your sugar traders, your sugar plantation owners, all right? And your merchants. Who's your merchant? Melanated folks. Their commercial ties facilitated a return to Judaism. In the late 16th century, Diego Diaz Querido moved from his native Porto to the Brazilian capital, Bahia, from where he shipped sugar to Portugal, ensuring it in Amsterdam. He then relocated to Amsterdam, was formally converted to Judaism, and was one of the founders of the city's first Jewish congregation. A visitation by the Portuguese Inquisition to Brazil in 1618 to 19 revealed that the connections between local new Christians, all right, these are crypto Jews, and Amsterdam went beyond commerce. The many Brazilian conversos or converts discovered Judaism were in touch with openly professing Jews in Amsterdam, meaning they got caught practicing their faith. Francisco Gomez Pina exemplified the bond between commerce and religion in this city. Pina exported sugar from Pernambuco to Amsterdam, but he was also an absentia, the co-founder of Amsterdam's Santa Compañía de Dotar Orfas e Doncellas Pobres in 1615, an organization which gave dowries to poor and orphan Sephardi girls in the region stretching from Saint-Jean-de-Luz in France to Danzig, including the Netherlands and Germany. You see where all these Sephardic people ended up, right? The man who represented him was Paulo de Pina, a fellow founder of the institution, perhaps the first Pina's relative. Paulo had moved from Lisbon to Pernambuco around 1600, returned to Lisbon 9 years later, and arrived finally in Holland, where he shed his Christian guise. The conversos who traded and traveled in the Portugal-Brazil-Amsterdam triangle helped create the premier Dutch commercial circuit in the Atlantic world. These are your Dutch traders, like I was saying earlier. These are your people who founded the Dutch West and East Indies companies. These merchants included some of the earliest Sephardi settlers of Amsterdam, such as Manuel Rodriguez Vega and Garcia Pimentel, who arrived respectively from Antwerp and Venice in the mid-1590s. Their commercial contacts extended to Portugal, Brazil, North Africa, Spain, England, and the Atlantic Islands, and the Levant. Manuel's brother Pedro Rodriguez Vega, who moved from Antwerp to Amsterdam in 1599, soon left for Bahia. There he bought a sugar plantation and sent cargoes of sugar and ginger to Manuel in Amsterdam, all right? He set up what? A sugar plantation in Brazil. And guess who he was using as his workers? Indians and indentured servants, not West Africans. And in the year 1618 alone, Paulo de Pina imported cargoes, no doubt principally sugar, from Brazil on 5 different ships, 3 Dutch and 2 Portuguese. Remember, we got a video during this time about who was really starting the sugar plantations, who were the sugar traders, and the Queen Elizabeth's involvement with the Sultan of Morocco, right, with these sugar plantations. In the same year, the all melanated people, all swarthy people, yes, on both sides. In the same year, the Portuguese Inquisition began its offensive against conversal merchants, especially in Porto, whose records reveal the variety of commercial connections between that port city and Amsterdam. This offensive cost the conversos and their Jewish relatives dearly, whether through arrests or confiscations. By September, the Jews of Amsterdam claimed to have lost more than half a million guilders, much of which was generated by the Brazil trade. Portuguese Jews and the Dutch invasion of Brazil. The Portuguese Jews, huh? So swarthy. Conversos in Portugal and Jews in Amsterdam also incurred serious losses after the renewal of Dutch Habsburg hostilities in 1621. As a rule, Dutch ships had previously left shipping between Portugal and Brazil unharmed. But with the establishment of the Dutch West India Company in 1621, there was a change of course. The company was founded, as one of its directors put it, to cut off the nerves and veins of the King of Spain's annual revenues, from which the blood and vivifying spirit spread through his large body. All right, so the Dutch West India Company is really not going with the Catholics. Who owns the duchies of Sephardic Jews and Moors? Statements like this one paved the way for Dutch privateers, pirates, to target shipping in the South Atlantic between Portugal and its South American colony. They were raiding the Catholic ships. Remember, same Catholics that were persecuting these same people. That's why, guys, you got to understand the whole context behind this. It's not just about countries. A contemporary Dutch historian asserted that the Portuguese port of Viana alone lost 26 of 29 ships active in the Brazil trade in the mid 1620s. Although the Jewish residents of Amsterdam were unintended victims of these maritime attacks, they could not count on compassion from the Dutch authorities. Attempts by Sephardi merchants in Amsterdam who shipped sugar from Brazil to Portugal, sugar to secure immunity from confiscation in the war that the West India Company was waging on Iberian shipping, were unsuccessful. Nonetheless, better times were ahead for Amsterdam Sephardim. Gentile Dutch entrepreneurs began to envisage direct control of all aspects of the sugar business, from cultivation to distribution. Profits would undoubtedly be higher and supplies to Brazil cheaper once customs duties were removed. The conquest of Brazil thus became an important item on the agenda at the first board meeting of the West India Company. Gotta get it back from the Catholics. The Dutch War of Independence was to be extended to the Americas. The source of the silver which financed Habsburg war making and Brazil commercially so attractive yet formally under Habsburg rule since 1580 was the West India Company's prime target. All right? The Sephardic Jews going against the Catholics, you see? The Portuguese nation, as Amsterdam Jewish community was known, contributed little to the West India Company. Its investments amount to a mere 36,100 guilders on half a percent of all capital raised between 1623 and 1626. Nevertheless, Jewish Portuguese participation grew over time, as suggested by contemporary documents from the Inquisition in Cartagena de Indias in present-day Colombia. Members of that town, Cofradia de Holanda, a crypto-Jewish organization founded to support the Dutch in their naval warfare with the Spanish or with the Catholics. Who's the Dutch? Sephardic Moorish people. Remember, I said they became the Dutch, especially the ones in the seas navigating in naval warfare, which were required to send 300 pesos annually to Amsterdam's Portuguese Jews. More than one witness attested that Juan Rodriguez Mesa, a Jew apparently born a new Christian in Portugal, possessed the Libro Grande of Cartagena's Cofradia, which, lined in colored calico, contained the names of all the group's members. Another converso member of this group, The Portuguese Duarte Lopes Mesa told the inquisitors that he had traveled to Amsterdam, describing how he had attended a meeting of what could only have been the West India Company board, although he did not call the company by its name. Support for Dutch military actions against Habsburg Spain also came from Portuguese New Christians and Jews in the Netherlands. Why? Because they're all the same people. New Christians, those are conversos, those are cryptos. Against who? The Habsburgs or Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, right? Charles V. Charles V, a so-called black man too. Many of them had no doubt once lived in Brazil, and soon after the West India Company was founded, their leaders, including one David Senior Coronel, alias Duarte Saraiva, had openly lobbied for a Dutch conquest of Brazil. Born in the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, Duarte Saraiva escaped to Amsterdam. Escaped what? The Inquisition, where he remarried in 1598. He was in Pernambuco in 1612, to which he later returned in the years following the Dutch invasion of 1630. He acquired 5 sugar plantations. The first Dutch conquest of Brazil had taken place 6 years earlier, when a fleet sponsored by the Dutch West India Company carrying 3,300 soldiers arrived at Brazil's capital of Salvador de Bahia in May 1624. The surprised Portuguese defenders quickly surrendered. This action was built was this action was but an interlude. Within 1 year, a Habsburg fleet had restored Spanish control of Bahia. Catholics, right? Undoubted the Dutch West India Company, or the Sephardic Jews, dispatched another fleet in December 1629. It was perhaps the largest that had ever crossed the Atlantic. Among the soldiers on board were at least 40 Iberian and 20 German Jews. The arrival of 52 ships and 13 sloops in Pernambuco in February of the next year augured a successful conquest. As the Dutch consolidated and then expanded the territory under their control in subsequent years, acquiring a large sugar producing area, Jews and conversos started settling in the port town of Recife and other parts of Pernambuco. In addition, several conversos living in Pernambuco reverted to Judaism. All right, they went back. They didn't have to hide anymore. They didn't have to be cryptos or in secret. Still, other new Christians adopted Judaism after coming to Recife from Portuguese Angola, while some Brazilian new Christians embarked for Amsterdam also in order to embrace Judaism. The Dutch conquest of the town of Paraiba may have convinced Domingos de Costa Brandão and Moisés de Almeida to travel to Amsterdam, where they were circumcised. Huh. Moisés' friend Manuel Rodriguez Monsanto, did the same, leaving with his family for Amsterdam and returning to Brazil around 1640. Not all Brazilians, Jews, remained faithful to Judaism. Starting in the early 1640s, some returned to Catholicism. Still, by 1645, there were hundreds of Jews in the region, and as late as 1649, 4 years after a movement of return migration to Europe had begun, some 350 Jews remained in Recife. Among the Jewish settlers arriving from Amsterdam, there were numerous poor who planned to settle in as yet uncolonized areas. Their disembarkation in Recife in 1638 caused some consternation. Governor Johann, all right, so I just want to point out, these are in history what they were telling you, you're whites, right? When the whites came, and a lot of these are Sephardic Moorish people, people of color, melanated folks, melanated Europeans, so-called black Europeans, all right, settling in these areas, poor, right? Poor, but trying to come up. And in fact, in the following years, their condition did not improve. By 1645, community leader Moses Navarro complained about the extreme poverty of the Jewish nation. Even respectable persons, he argued, had resigned themselves to live on charity. So it wasn't always good times. But hey, they were running the ports, as we're reading. Jewish activity and liberties in Dutch Brazil. If Jews had encouraged the West India Company to invade Brazil, Jewish intervention was also instrumental in the extension of the privileges that were granted in the Dutch colonies. Jewish liberties were already prescribed in both the outline for the government of Dutch Bahia in 1624 and the administrative rules issued in 1629 for all Dutch colonies then or ever to be, possessed by the West India Company. Whether Jews had actively lobbied for these privileges is not clear, but the privileges were no simple act of Gentile benevolence. The Jews' conspicuous significance in transatlantic commerce earned them the right to retail trade in Brazil, which was not recognized in Amsterdam. What is more, after a Jewish company lost 50 men in 1645, fighting against a Portuguese enemy, even on the Sabbath, the Dutch Estates General ordered the Jews in Dutch Brazil were to be compensated for damage to person or property. Thus, from 1645, Jews were considered full-fledged subjects of the Dutch state, a status the Jews in the United Provinces would not obtain until the 1650s. Still, the Jews of Recife had to defend their privileges both before and after 1645. The Dutch Reformed Church in Brazil consistently opposed religious tolerance, and on at least two occasions in 1637 and 1653, private Christian residents tried to have the privilege of retail trade revoked. The Jews of Brazil, they said, should enjoy no wider rights than did those of Amsterdam. Abraham de Acevedo responded in 1653 in a letter sent to the West India Company. De Acevedo argued that every resident of the colony came from abroad. They came from abroad, all foreign. No one group could claim prior or superior rights. In addition, through their service on guard duty and their provisioning of the various territories conquered by the Dutch, Jews had been indispensable to the colony. Third, contrary to other nations, the Jews in Brazil had never wavered in their loyalty. Not a single person had defected to the enemy. The Estates General fully agreed with de Acevedo's claim that the economic and military contribution of the Jews were vital. Recife's Jews also joined hands with their Christian neighbors in 1637 and sent a letter to the West India Company requesting a measure of free trade between the United Provinces and Brazil. A year later, the Estates General agreed to the request, stripping the West India Company of its monopolies, except for the slave trade. Yep, who's running it? Again, check out my series, The Real Slave Trade. Who's involved? The import of war ammunition and the export of Brazil wood. The liberalization of trade benefited Jews who were already in Brazil and lured new groups of Jews from across the Atlantic. Along with other settlers, Jews also helped build the towns where they resided. The twin cities of Dutch Brazil were almost entirely new creations. Recife was originally but a small port, and the nearby island of Antonio Vaz was almost uninhabited. Jews contributed to the construction of the town of Mauricia on that island and were involved in the remarkable expansion of Recife. A Jew was also involved in the construction of the long bridge that linked the towns. Jewish foundations of Curaçao. The Jewish contribution to Curaçao was even more important. Although blessed with an excellent natural harbor, Curaçao did not have a town when the first Jews arrived in 1651. The coming of the Jews changed the island's character beyond recognition, all right? It had a lot to do with the development of Curaçao here, guys. From a barren place where the European presence was largely confined to a fort with a garrison, Curaçao was transformed into one of the busiest ports of the New World. Significantly, Willemstad, the town that sprang up around the harbor, was first mentioned by name in a letter written by Jewish settler. All right. Hey, Oli Ben, welcome to the club. Thank you. Appreciate it very much for the support, becoming a member. João de Ilan, 1609 to 1697, a former settler of Dutch Brazil, and a cousin of the above-mentioned Garcia de Ilan, was a vital link in Curaçao's development. After successfully negotiating the establishment of a Jewish colony, despite the negative attitudes toward Jews held by members of the West India Company Board, Elon risked expulsion by engaging in commerce. His permit of residence allowed him only to cultivate fruits and other produce. The company directors in Amsterdam worried aloud that Jan de Ilan accomplishes little there and concerns himself little with agriculture. Ilan was a poor Jew, even if in his day Curaçao lacked all port functions, from ship owning, shipbuilding and repair, to stevedoring, finance, or inland transport facilities. In Europe, a decade before, Elon's commercial contacts had extended to Lisbon, Rio de Janeiro, and Angola. Remember who actually colonized Angola, guys? It was Brazilian settlers, it was Brazilian people. So a lot of them were Sephardic Jews, a lot of them were Sephardic Jews mixed with Indians, a lot of them were Indians that had gone over there and settled and colonized Angola. That's who colonized Angola. In Curaçao, he started importing horses and supplying flour and clothing to the West India Company employees. He was followed by other Jews such as Joshua and Mordecai Enriquez, described in contemporary documents as peddlers and traders in cattle. Jehoshua, Jehoshua is also said to have encouraged Jews from Amsterdam to move to Curaçao. In due course, commercial ties were forged for Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and the mainland, but initially Curaçao's Jews had no choice but to sell goods to the West India Company, which contributed these supplies among its garrison in the 1640s and 1650s. Soldiers still made up the bulk of the island's Dutch population. The poor Jews of Willemstad and Recife, Mauritia must be understood in terms of their hinterlands and forelands. The expanding and contracting areas that made up Dutch Brazil formed the hinterland exploited by the Jews of Recife in the peaceful years until 1645, when the twin cities of Recife and Mauritia grew and the sugar trade boomed. They collected taxes and freighted ships bound for the United Provinces. After successive defeats had reduced the area under Dutch control, blocking Dutch access to Brazilian sugar, the poor Jews transformed themselves into army contractors. Ironically, a line of business in which the court Jews of Europe excelled. Their main customers were the Dutch troops, who were always in need of shirts and shoes. Listen to this, eh? From a commercial perspective, Dutch Brazil last year thus resembled the early period of Dutch Curaçao, shuttling back and forth between Recife and Amsterdam. All right, so this is not about liking or disliking, this is just history, guys. As settlers in a colonial empire, the port Jewries of Brazil and Curaçao had the same foreland. They shared the same land area on the seaward side of a port, beyond maritime space, and with which the port was connected by ocean carriers. Since trade was only allowed with ports in the colonial metropolis, ships sailed back and forth to Amsterdam. The old triangle, Brazil, Portugal, and Amsterdam, had vanished after the Dutch invasion of Brazil. Amsterdam, Sephardim, all right, Sephardic people, melanated people, tried hard to resuscitate the triangular trade during truce negotiations between Portugal and the United Provinces in 1641. But their efforts were in vain. With Portugal inaccessible, the only Atlantic passage open to the Jews of Recife and Amsterdam in the mid 17th century was that between these two ports, which also furthered these two communities' integration. Yet there were limits. Daniel Swetschinsky has shown how closely integrated the Amsterdam Sephardi community was with those of Hamburg and later London. The same numbers of Amsterdam bridges and grooms married in Hamburg as vice versa. This level of reciprocity, reciprocity, there you go, did not exist between Recife and Amsterdam. Nonetheless, the transatlantic route connecting the two ports was well traveled. Ishak, Mokata, Ovejo, for example, probably a native of Brazil, lived in Amsterdam in 1639, 1642, and again in 1644. He returned to Recife in the latter year, but was back in Amsterdam 5 years later. Francisco de Faria was born in Portuguese Pernambuco, converted to Judaism, went to Amsterdam in 1635 with his wife and two children, appears on communal lists in Recife in 1643, and returned finally to Amsterdam by 1652. So you see how they were moving back and forth. Aharon Serfati was not a native of Brazil. A relative of Paulo de Pina, Sephardi was the first Portuguese Jew to be circumcised in Amsterdam in 1597. Really? His name is found in Dutch Brazil in 1637, but a year later he returned to Amsterdam. and became president of the Talmud Torah. Now remember, guys, these are not the first so-called Jews or Hebrews or people who circumcised themselves in this region of the world. We had many people traveling through there before that were most likely doing that. All right, we got the drop in previous videos, right? His name is found in Dutch Brazil in 1637, but a year later he returned to Amsterdam and became president of the Talmud Torah. However, after 1646, he returned to Brazil, where he was elected president of Recife's Tessor, Israel congregation in 1653. He died in Amsterdam in 1640. The Jews of Willemstad repeated this pattern of frequent oceanic crossings. Abraham Drago, for instance, like Drake or Drago, right? Like Drake, same thing, same family. For instance, himself a former resident of Recife was among the first Jewish settlers in Curaçao in 1651. He returned to Amsterdam within a few years, but as late as 1680, he brought 7 families to Willemstad. Jews began to leave Recife, Mauricia, after the start of a rebellion in 1645 that ended in the Portuguese conquest of Dutch Brazil in 1654. Admittedly, the return of 200 Jewish families to Amsterdam weighed heavily on the local community, but thanks to the resources of some of the more well-to-do Amsterdam Sephardim, witnessed a new economic boom. Moreover, despite Brazil's disappearance from their horizons, the world beyond the Atlantic kept beckoning. In coming years, Jewish settlements were founded in various localities in the Caribbean and Circum-Caribbean. This settlement was encouraged by a number of crises, especially a demographic one. The arrival in Hamburg and Amsterdam of Jews from Dutch Brazil and crypto Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, following the downfall of Gaspar de Guzman, the once powerful Count Duke of Olivares, who had been their protector, led to the overcrowding in both cities. The need to create new places where these Jews might live was urgent. Where are we going to put all these Sephardic Jews and Moors? Communities that came into being after the Brazilian exodus included Barbados. That's where Martinique, yeah, right there, New Amsterdam, yeah, New York, remember? They were coming from Brazil. A lot of these Dutch, so-called Dutch, they were Sephardic Jews that were coming from Brazil. Yes, settlements in Guyana were founded through the efforts of former residents of Dutch Brazil who had initially returned to the Netherlands, most notably David Cohen Nazi, Abraham Cohen. We got these names in the previous video we had recently, right? Felipe de Fuentes and Moses Neto. In 1657, Nazi signed a contract with the estates of Sealand, which allowed him and other Brazilian veterans of the Hebrew nation to carve out an agricultural colony in Essequibo in western Guyana, right? That's in South America. All Jews were granted freedom of religion and conscience, and they were not required to appear in court on the Sabbath or on Jewish holidays. Jews also settled in the nearby Pomeroon River. However, both colonies were destroyed by English troops in 1666. An equally short life was granted to the Dutch colony of Cayenne, where Nazi had obtained extensive privileges in 1659, but which fell into French hands 5 years later. Some refugees from these abortive colonies found their way to the English settlement of Suriname, which in turn was seized by the Dutch force in 1667. In Guyana, therefore, rural Jewish settlements, far from any port, were the legacy of entrepreneurial port Jews like Nazi. Port Jews thus were sojourners in a dynamic Atlantic world. During the first decades of the 17th century, Portuguese crypto Jews established connections between Amsterdam and various ports in the Atlantic through migration, travel, and trade. Although Portuguese ports were originally an important link in the Sephardic commercial network, warfare virtually precluded the continuation of trade with Portugal after 1621. Attempts to revive the old network after Portugal's independence in 1641 failed, as the Dutch authorities vowed to continue the war. Under the circumstances, the link between Amsterdam and Recife assumed great significance for the Portuguese port Jews who incessantly crossed the ocean with their goods and letters of exchange. But the Atlantic route was not just a trade route. Both before and after 1630, it was a road that enabled a return to ancestral belief and served to unify port juries on both sides of the ocean. All right, here's all your sources. A lot of sources. All right, again, from the Jewish History Journal. Let me go back up. One second. So, an article in Jewish History Journal or academic, I guess, how do you call it? Yeah, journal from June 2006. Communities of poor Jews and their contacts in the Dutch Atlantic world. All right. Let's see, guys, what we got here. Got a little bonus here. Hold on. We got a little bonus here. All right, so now I want to get into we got a little bonus here, guys. 1 second. All right, for the dismount. Thanks for tuning in, everybody in the chat. Hope you guys enjoying it and seeing this history that's not really emphasized or taught to us in detail. The importance and who these people really were, what they really look like, so you can understand the history, the true history, have a true perspective on things and people. All right. So we're going to continue for the dismount here on this journal right here. All right. So now I want to get into this article. Scholarly article says here the role of. So this is an excerpt from a very old video. We're going to just get a quick part here, act like it's the first time. It's going to correlate a little bit what we were just talking about. All right. Sephardic Jews in the British Caribbean area during the 17th century. All right. We already know they were the sugar planters, so we're going to get some more correlation here. This is from the Caribbean Studies Journal, Volume 4, Number 3, from October 1964, pages 32 to 49. It's about 18 pages. See how much we can get in today. This is the article right here by Gordon Merrill. The role of Sephardic Jews, Sephardis, all right, people of color. All right, and it says down here in the second paragraph, we're going to begin. It says the transformation of almost uninhabited islands in the Caribbean from a state of nature to agricultural colonies producing sugar for a distant market took place within the remarkably short span of 50 years in the 17th century. All right, so here what they're saying, they grabbed these islands who were very natural and beautiful, probably had a lot of indigenous vegetation, animals, and people, and they turned them into basically sugar producing markets for a distant market for people, for foreign people. What happened to all the local stuff? The accomplishment is even more surprising. All right, listen to this. When it is realized that neither the English planter nor the African slave had any significant previous experience with sugarcane agriculture and the system of sugar manufacture. Okay, there was no African slave brought over here to grow sugar. They didn't know anything about sugar growing. It wasn't them, and it wasn't no English white man planter. Letting you know straight up, there's major drop right here. All right, we should have already concluded that as we're learning, watching this video today, right? Where's the Africans in all of this? Get what I'm saying? They're telling you right here too the same thing. All right. However, Brazil was an important producer of sugar, but somebody was doing it, because Brazil was an important producer of sugar during the early decades of the 17th century, and it is illogical to look for influences from that quarter. All right. So who was running things in that quarter? This is what he's letting you know. It is sometimes claimed that Portuguese Jews from Brazil were no innovators of change in these British colonies during the 17th century, bringing capital, trading skills, slaves, and much needed experience in sugarcane agriculture and sugar manufacture at a critical time in the development of the colonies.
This article attempts to establish the facts in order to draw a recent conclusion on the role of the Sephardic Jews in this part of the world during the 17th century, who's running things, who's really setting up shop and helping all these empires grow. Sephardic Jews and their trade and merchandise skills and their growing agricultural skills too with the sugar, their knowledge with the sugar plantations. All right, Sephardic Jews. The curiosity of the writer concerning the Sephardic Jews was aroused in 1952 on first examining the dozen or so remaining tombstones in an unkept Jewish cemetery on Nevis. All right, Nevis, remember Alexander Hamilton? He was a Jewish. Again, he was a Sephardic Jew. That's what we already know. Alexander Hamilton, a person of color. Again, they were calling him a Negro, mulatto, Swarty. They were calling him all these things. We got the video already. All right, he was Huguenot and Sephardic Jew. Huguenot and Sephardic Jew. It boils down to almost the same thing. The dates of burial were from 1660 to 1725. Richard Pottis, in his authoritative book on Nevis, recorded the commercial activity of the Portuguese Jews on the island during that period. Long abandoned burial grounds for these folks exist on the other islands in the Lesser Antilles, and Jewish synagogues have survived into the 20th century of Barbados and Jamaica. All right, so this Jewish cemeteries, again, Alexander Hamilton's ancestors are buried in these Jewish cemeteries. And we got the video and explaining that and showing that. All right, so they're all over these places in Barbados as well, in Jamaica as well. The immediate place of origin of the Jews was Brazil. Most of them had to come out of Brazil, but out of Brazil they had to come originally from Amsterdam or directly from Spain or Portugal, being exiled, or from other countries they were exiled in. So the whole history here, right? So they was from Brazil, from which they fled in the middle of the 17th century in order to escape religious persecution. The ultimate origin of these folks lies in the Mediterranean world. Persecution and forced migration of the Sephardic Jews began in Spain in 1478 with the establishment of the Inquisition. A similar experience of forced migration awaited them in Brazil almost 200 years later. Although the major aim of this paper is to throw whatever light is possible on the role of the Sephardic Jews in the British colonies of the Caribbean, it is necessary to sketch in their background in Europe and in Brazil, and the organization of the paper is to that end. All right, so very scholarly to do that. He's basically saying he's going to do what I'm basically trying to do. I went back, when I did my Sephardi video, I'm still learning. I'm trying to figure out who these guys are, but even though we know they do have some kind of Hebrew, might have Israelite, Edomite, Moabite blood, Canaanite blood in them, Ishmaelite blood in them, Arabs, they have some kind of Jewish, and they are related to some people in Asia Minor, the original Sephardi area over there. I think that's what he's about to get into. It says European background. It says Sephardic Jews have a long, at times illustrious history in Europe. Semitic traders from Sidon and Tyre traveled the length of the Mediterranean world in classical times and settled on the distant Iberian shores. The Jews were influential during the Roman period, but they enjoyed a truly golden age under the Moors. All right? What? We got this a lot in my past videos, Columbus and his Negro friends. We also got it in the Moorish videos that I made. No more hijack, no more misunderstanding. The Sephardic Jews actually were very prosperous. That was their golden age time too, under the Moors, when they were free to move within Muslim world in search of economic and intellectual gains. They became rich, aristocratic, learned, haughty, and powerful. The Sephardic Jews and the Moors, they were together, is what I showed you. Eventually the name Sepharad, the original was over there, came to be applied by the Hebrews to the kingdoms of Castilla, Navarra, Aragon, and Portugal. And Jews of Spain and Portuguese origin became known as Sephardic Jews. All right, again, people of color living prosperous under the Moors, their brothers and cousins. In contrast to the Ashkenazim, all right, it's different. All right, listen to this. Sephardic Jews, in contrast to the Ashkenazims or European Jews of Slavonic origin, they're different. All right, you were blaming these people this whole time. You were picturing these Ashkenazi European Jews of Slavonic origin. That's what you were always picturing. And it was actually the Sephardic Jews living under the Moors, prosperous, their brothers, right? A lot of them related, you know, it was actually them setting up shop, colonizing over here first. Sephardic Jews adopted a veneer of Christianity under the compulsion of the Inquisition. So they adopted Christianity, right? They had to become what? Presbyterians, Protestants, Quakers, Baptists, all right? You know, these new Christians. And those who emigrated to the New World were termed New Christians, like I just said, appropriately and disapprovingly by the Spanish chroniclers. The Sephardic Jews were archly conservative in outlook, preserving the intellectual traditions that had evolved in Moorish Spain and North Africa. They invited the attention of bigots in an age of religious intolerance. The conservatism of the Sephardim is still to be observed in the 20th century in the attachment to a particular pronunciation of Hebrew and in the instinctive preference for an unchanging simplicity of service in the synagogue. Furthermore, congregations of Spanish Jews in the United States who have been away from Spain for centuries are said to retain to the present time the Spanish language. In the Middle Ages, Spain and Portugal, in somewhat contrasting ways, attempted to solve the problem posed by these rich, influential folk of unpopular belief, and in so doing, Portugal in particular produced a number of new Christians prepared to throw off the cloak of new religion at the first opportunity. All right, who these people were, what is their history. We eventually got all this, but it was important to know, like I did showed in my video, that they were merchants and they were traders from way back, from ancient times. They had all the routes. That's why it was natural for them to become the merchants in the sea. You get what I'm saying? These Moranos, especially when they were under the Moors, right? The Moors going around, these old school Phoenicians, you know, influencing these old school Danites. All right, so continue a little further. In this article says, at the beginning of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal contained no practicing Jews, only new Christians or Moranos. All right, they had to practice in secret, as they were known in the Iberian Peninsula. Although they were forbidden to leave their homelands, lest they discard the new religion, before the long, Morano fugitives began to appear in other parts of Europe. Many of them reached the Low Countries of Northern Europe in the late 15th, 16th century, where they maintained an outward attachment to Christianity. All right, what is that? Protestantism. Portuguese Morano communities at home played an important role in overseas trade and enjoyed connections with new Christian communities abroad. They were starting to establish their network. By way of example, the great Morano mercantile House of Mendes, which held the coveted pepper monopoly, all but rivaled the Fuggers at one time in the extent and importance of its transactions. In 1512, the House of Mendes established its Antwerp branch. Antwerp, remember that? An indication of the network of international financial power in the hands of the Portuguese Jews. Amsterdam and Antwerp became centers of Morano population and power during the 16th century. Centers. Who was running stuff in Amsterdam and who was there also hugging us, right? Remember, we're going to get into that again. The Inquisition was established in Portugal in 1531, and new Christians from their south a refuge in Northern Europe. The trickle of fugitives became a flood after the declaration of Dutch independence in 1579, which brought the expectation of full religious freedom. Within a few years, Moranos settled in Amsterdam as Jews, and they were joined by many others from Antwerp who threw off the cloak of secrecy and openly practiced Judaism. Amsterdam eventually had over 4,000 Sephardic Jews and gained the title of the Dutch Jerusalem. It is noteworthy that until the establishment of the State of Israel, Amsterdam remained the spiritual center of Sephardic Jewish communities scattered throughout the world. You hear that? Amsterdam, Dutch. During this period, England remained close to Sephardic refugees. At this point, it is useful to turn to the entry of these folk into Brazil, from which they later spread into the Caribbean area and North America. All right, so see what we're getting into, right? It says number 2. The entry of Sephardic Jews into the New World. Spain and Portugal sought by legislation to keep their colonies in the New World free of Jews and new Christians. Persecution at home and the magnet of trading opportunity abroad encouraged these folks to work against that policy. Many succeeded, for such restrictive laws are difficult to enforce in any age. Furthermore, it appears that official policy did not remain unshaken over the centuries involved. From time to time, new Christians were able to secure the suspension of the restrictive laws by purchase, For example, in 1509, an agreement was reached in Seville between the conversos and the crown, whereby new Christians were permitted to go to the colonies for purposes of trade periods not exceeding 2 years on payment of a fee of 20,000 ducats. Also, it appears that on occasion, officialdom wavered in its basic policy and permitted new Christians to emigrate to the colonies, probably in recognition of the need for colonists. So they were making deals with them, like I was saying earlier, right? In any event, facts speak clearly. Thousands of Sephardic Jews managed by legal means or otherwise to reach the New World as new Christians. Thousands. Life had been subject to suspicion and intrigue for the secret Jews in Portugal. The Inquisitions of Lisbon, Coimbra, and Evora held 47 great autos de fe between 1612 and 1630, and this feverish activity against the secret Jew provided the motive to illegal emigration. The Inquisition went to astounding lengths to identify the non-believers and to save their souls at the expense of their lives. The religious quality of the blood was examined and classified by the agents of the Inquisition with obvious zeal. Heretics were judged to be full, 3/4, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, partly or more than partly new Christians. The attraction of a freer society in the New World must have been great for these Jews. Recife in northern Brazil fell to the Dutch in 1630. Within 6 years, Dutch control extended from Rio San Francisco in the south to the captaincy of Maranhão in the north, and the Dutch colony became known as New Holland. All right, New Holland in Brazil. There was a considerable amount of religious toleration in a population that contained Dutch Protestants. All right, there we go, Protestants. Who's these Protestants? Huguenots, right? Portuguese Catholics, New Christians, professing Jews, native Indians, and Negro slaves. A lot of these people are the same. In 1634, the State General issued a proclamation guaranteeing Jews and Catholics the free practice of their religion without investigation of their conscience or their home. Under these circumstances, the Moranos threw off the cloak of Christianity and openly embraced their own religion. They were joined by numerous Jewish immigrants from Holland, and in 1640, the Jewish inhabitants of Recife were said to be more numerous than the Christians. By 1654, the city is reported to have had 5,000 Jewish inhabitants. Attention is now directed to the economic activities of these folks. Contemporary accounts are not numerous, but John Nieuwhof has left a rather detailed account of New Holland, which he visited in 1643. Nieuwhof was impressed by the sugar industry in the colony, to the point of proclaiming that no other place in the West Indies could enter the industry with any prospect of profit. As for the Jewish inhabitants, he wrote, all right, among the free inhabitants of Brazil that were not in the company's service, Dutch West India Company, the Jews were the most considerable in number, who had transported themselves thither from Holland. They came from Holland. Who were these Holland Jews? They were Sephardic Portuguese people of color. They had a vast traffic beyond all the rest. They purchased sugar mills and built stately houses in the Recife. They were all traders, which could have been of great consequence to the Dutch Brazil had they kept themselves within the due bounds of traffic. All right, and continuing a little bit ahead, it says, during the course of the struggle by the Portuguese. All right, so remember what's going on. I know it's a lot of info, guys. I don't know if you guys are bored or not, but I hope you guys are enjoying this information. You know, I just, for me putting it all together, it's just, I'm just like, wow. You know, I just wanted everybody to see this information and kind of like get a whole background behind it, you know, a real historical background of who these people are and everything. It's not just labels like Portuguese, Jews, Dutch, you know, these are people, there's backgrounds behind these people, you know. It's like they call anybody an American today, right? Is everybody indigenous to America that they're being called American, you know? So just like these people, they might be called Dutch, they might be called French, but a lot of them are Sephardic Jews or Muslim Moors from Spain and Portugal. All right, this is the what I'm trying to show in this particular study, the presentation, and it says here, you know, that, you know, the Dutch had control of Brazil for a bit. You know, they had taken it from the Portuguese, and, you know, Jews were like, yeah, you know, we get to be Jews again and everything. So eventually, the Portuguese regained control of Brazil, or this part. So what happened? Many Jews basically became convinced that for their own safety, they should move to neighboring colonies, such as Cayenne and Suriname. The fall of Recife in 1654, so that's when the Portuguese took over again. Thousands of Jews were given 3 months to leave Brazil, or suffered the consequences of open adherence to Judaism and Catholic colony. And I remember, even though a lot of these are originally Portuguese people that they're calling Jewish, and it's Portugal who's taking the control. Remember, these are Portuguese Catholic Empire now. This is the Portuguese Catholic Empire. And who most likely people of color too. It's not like, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, that was Charles V who was doing that against the Protestant faith and Jews and Moors, Muslims. So they were given 3 months to leave, these Jews in Brazil, or suffer the consequences of open adherence to Judaism and Catholic colony. These were the events that linked together all the Sephardic Jewish communities scattered throughout the Caribbean region during the 17th and 18th centuries. So again, they'll say that, if they didn't come directly from Holland or from Portugal, Spain, these Sephardic Jews, in history, they'll tell us, well, they came from Brazil. Now we know the whole background, how they got to Brazil, who are these people, and what happened, and how they ended up in these other islands in the Caribbean, like Nevis, Jamaica, Suriname, Trinidad. Eventually, descendants of these folk established Sephardic communities in seaports along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. Eventually, where did they end up? In North America, along where? The Atlantic seaboard. I want to South Carolina, right? Particularly in the cities of Providence, Newport, and New York. All right, you see? Providence, Newport, and New York. Rhode Island, Newport, New Jersey, or New York, and then New York, right? It's convenient at this point in the narrative to pause and to consider the prospects of that faced the Portuguese Jews about to leave Brazil. The vast majority.
All right, so yeah, I was muted earlier. Sorry about that, guys. What I was saying is a little confusing, but they're saying when the Portuguese came, these people had to leave. But as you guys see, they're also Portuguese Jews. So it's not just about, you know, a Dutch, because they were referred to as Dutch when they were in Brazil, because had a lot of them were already coming from Holland, Amsterdam. They had been there a lot of years after the Inquisition, but a lot of them had Portuguese roots. So it's Portuguese versus Portuguese. The only difference is Catholics versus, new Christians or crypto Jews, Moors, Muslims, the Inquisition. So that's what I was saying. Sorry about that, guys.
Of these folks sought and eventually gained entry into English-speaking lands. Public opinion in England at that time was against permitting Jews to enter the country. The story began to circulate in England in 1649 that the Jews had offered to buy St. Paul's Cathedral and the Bodleian Library, inconceivable as truth but well designed to increase the blood pressure of patriotic Englishmen. During the Protectorate, Oliver Cromwell displayed religious toleration in advance of his times and probably some appreciation of potential economic development in allowing some Jews to enter the country. They were Sephardic Jews, but more probably from Amsterdam than from Brazil. Cromwell met the question of Jewish immigration into England obliquely by failing to pronounce a course political action not unknown in the 20th century. It worked to the advantage of the Jews in that they were not singled out for special taxation. It was not until later in the 17th century that the legal rights to reside and trade in England was restored to them. In contrast, the colonial authorities in England were well disposed toward the entry of Jewish refugees from Brazil into the colonies of the Caribbean region. At the same time, the Dutch authorities encouraged Jewish migration to their mainland and inland colonies, lying to the north of Brazil. For their part, the Jews, with experience as traders and planters, with capital and slaves, were anxious to carry on with a lucrative enterprise in sugar. Accordingly, within the space of a few years, Portuguese Jews became residents of the Guiana coast and the various islands from the mainland Suriname to Jamaica, where they engaged in trading and agricultural pursuits. All right, so you see how they're populating the rest of the Caribbean and eventually into North America.
Hey, guys, thanks for tuning in today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I wanted to read that full article about the poor Jews so you guys can understand. There was a lot of commerce going on. They had a lot of connections and this triangular trade. They are involved heavily with the West and East India companies, and these are your privateers and your pirates taking, stuff from the Catholic ships. And there's a whole background and context that wasn't really explained to us correctly in school. All right. And a lot of people can talk and say things and give opinions, but we're trying to show the actual sources and the history that you can verify. All right. Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate you taking the time. Make sure to check out the video I did earlier if you haven't. I had dropped one earlier as well. Make sure to check out the membership of my channel if you want to support me that way, or my Patreon page. I have a lot of books here on my Patreon I share. We're gonna have exclusive stuff for the patrons and members, so make sure to support me if you like that way. Only if you're willing and able. No worries if you can't. I'm gonna continue to do what I do anyway. So, don't worry about that. Much love and respect. Uh, Pura vida, mi gente. Yeah, MHOE. Yeah, most high over everything. Most high over everything. Wow, we're going out with Omic 12, Ocelos 12's beat. Wata. Wata. Nice little melody to go out with, all right? Wow.